Welcome to the Short Funk Podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet, and today I don't want to give it a particularly convoluted title, but let's just describe it as reprogramming. Through periods of time in my life, I've experienced events which can be loosely described as reprogramming events. They're typically events that have one or more of these components: isolation, controlled narrative, the threat of verbal or physical violence, in some cases also positive conditions. When I reflect on the period of time that I was in ELANS, certainly isolation, controlled narrative, and the threat of physical violence were all there. And I reflected how long it took me to actually embody the circumstances that confronted me in almost a survival state. I've also had experiences with people who are particularly verbally violent and have a controlled narrative. And to be quite critical, most of these incidents involve dealing with folks who either want to be business partners or who are business partners in some regard. My experience with Wozniak and his crew featured a number of people, actually, that had some of these characteristics, and certainly the controlled narrative element was a thread throughout all of them. I've also lived in conditions of particular destitution, at least for periods of time. I've never been homeless, but I've been in conditions which have been subpar. And here I reflect on the period of time that I was in the shed, particularly the winters in the shed, and also my time at the Leicester YMCA. Here I felt isolated. I certainly had a controlled narrative around me. And through one extent or another, certainly at the Leicester YMCA, there was a threat of physical violence that was pretty well omnipresent. When I think about how I dealt with these forms of reprogramming, it was purely along survival lines. I was able quickly to adapt and utilize narrative in order to protect myself to a certain extent, but these were circumstances that were suboptimal. They were not particularly ideal. When I start exploring this idea of reprogramming, however, I start to realize that actually most of life can be viewed in this reprogramming form. True, there may not be threats of physical or verbal violence at various points in your life, but the conditions that you find yourself in ultimately lead to some change in narrative. Some of this might be survival-oriented, but a portion of it could be relating to actually dealing with circumstances beyond your control and, just adapting to the environment. When I think about reprogramming and I think about the experiences that I have had associated with this, I'm relatively sympathetic to the fact that this affects almost everyone. There are certain individuals that have had very strong abilities to survive in environments and return from these environments unscarred, or at least unscarred for an external observer. But I think every interaction that involves some change of internal narrative, some change of survival mechanisms, some change of dealing with a circumstance is a form of reprogramming. And I think about this very strongly in terms of folks who have a variety of life experiences and have survived through them. There's also this phenomena of folks who, for example, find themselves in multiple abusive relationships over periods of their life, and people who actively look for abusive spouses. And in these circumstances, I think there could be a lot more dedicated understanding associated with this idea of reprogramming. You'll note I'm not using notions like linguistic reprogramming or cognitive reprogramming or a variety of the general terms associated with reprogramming. The things that interest me is ultimately change based on circumstances beyond people's control. And in some cases, circumstances which are specifically tailored for the reprogramming exercise. I think of the military in this regard. I mean, that's ultimately the need of the military, is to take an individual and then fundamentally reprogram them through a variety of things, potentially isolation, clearly controlled narrative, verbal violence, and perhaps even in some cases physical violence. But let's talk about the last point, positive conditions. Positive conditions can actually create conditions of reprogramming that are very difficult to critically discuss. Because in certain circumstances, if things are particularly good, but also artificially created as being good, then it's very difficult to think of this critically as something that probably needs to change. I've talked historically in this podcast associated with the healthcare that politicians receive. I think this is an element of positive condition reprogramming, which ultimately creates a distance between these individuals and regular folks that just have to survive. But when I look at my own life, there have also been times of positive conditions leading to negative reprogramming. And it is something that I am quite critical about in my own life. This notion of being bourgeois or middle class and various negative reactions associated with that, I think relate to positive condition reprogramming. Anyway, this was an idea to float in a short funk with the view that these kind of elements certainly affect my thinking and the development of Noble Ape as well. Tom Barbalet in San Jose, signing out.